LinkedIn presents.
Have you ever had a boss who just infuriated you? I'm Morra Aarons-Mele, and this is The Anxious Achiever, the show that looks at the intersection of mental health and work and asks, how can we do both better?
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA, which provides AI solutions that are easy to implement, secure, and tailor to your business. Visit Dell.com to learn more.
Work is about the people, and how happy we are at work has a lot to do with how we relate to those around us, right? Our peers, and especially our bosses. One of my favorite statistics is that your manager has as big an effect on your mental health as your spouse does, or your partner. This is what most people say. This can have a huge impact on our well-being and our mental health and how much we want to show up at our jobs. And why is it that some leaders seem to just get everyone excited and they make things seem attainable and their vision is clear and simple and yes? And some leaders create healthy, psychologically safe environments. And others, well, just seem to clash with everyone. It might not be so black and white as that, but it can feel that way. And this is something Adam Galinsky, my guest today, understands really well. He has studied leadership and what makes someone inspiring for 20 years. On the flip side, he also has insight into what makes a leader uninspiring, downright infuriating. We talk about the role of anxiety and insecurity in all of this. Galinsky is a professor and vice dean at Columbia Business School, a social psychologist, and the author of the new book, Inspire, the Universal Path for Leading Yourselves and Others. Here's our chat.
There's this distinction I make between being inspiring and being infuriating. But I think one of the core themes of my research is, one of my, I think, really most important discoveries is that inspiring people and infuriating people exist on this sort of enduring continuum. They're essentially mirror images of each other, right? And you can just think of a couple of different ones, like the inspiring person is generous, right? The infuriating person is selfish. The inspiring person is courageous. The infuriating person is cowardly, right? The inspiring person sees the larger picture, the bigger purpose. The, infuriating leader is like lost in the weeds. And so that has a lot of implications for how we navigate the world. And the implication of that is we are not born as inspiring or infuriating people. It's our current behavior that inspires and infuriates. Now, that is incredibly a hopeful and optimistic message, because that means that if we can change our behavior, right, we can move from the infuriating end of the continuum to the inspiring end of the continuum. The second thing that my research shows is that that continuum is really made up of these three universal factors. And I kind of already alluded to them, right? How we see the world, which is, being visionary. And that I mentioned, seeing the big picture versus, being lost in the weeds. How we are in the world, right? And being an exemplar is what I call it. And that's like being courageous versus cowardly is one example. And then being an inspiring mentor, how we interact with others. And that's that selfish versus generosity. And one of the things is that you could be really high on the inspiring end on one or two of those dimensions, but be low on the other dimension. We can be inspiring and infuriating at the same time. And sometimes we can even be the same dimension and the same characteristic, right? Maybe seeing the big picture could be really inspiring, but also really frustrating when someone wants to just get something done.
Yes.
So I think that those really matter. And I think we can think about the different roles that different mental states play in leading us down those different paths. And, anxiety, I published a paper called Anxious and Egocentric, and gets back at that incredible link to perspective taking we talked about. And what we showed in our research that, this was a multi-country, multi-lab paper published in, one of our top psychology journals with many different studies. But we basically end up showing is that when people are anxious, and other people have shown when people are angry, so anxious and angry both have similar effects here, is that it narrows our attention. It reduces our perspective taking and makes us also less visionary because it's harder to see the big picture when we get anxious. At the same time, right, anxiety is in some ways a constructive emotion because it's telling us that a task that we're about to do is really important, right? And it's telling us that we need to activate all of our abilities to handle the situation that we're going in. And sometimes, right, when we can harness that anxiety, we can be more courageous. And sort of how we deal with that anxiety more or less effectively can really determine whether we're more inspiring or infuriating.
Yeah, actually, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, right? And so the key is that I guess if you have a tendency to be anxious, how do you then sort of pull back when it's time to take stock of the big picture and not jump? We can be very impulsive when we're anxious, not jump right in, right? And sort of step back for that creative space.
Yeah, and I think stepping back is actually one of the key ingredients for seeing the big picture, right? And how do we do that both psychologically and even sometimes physically to be able to do that? Dealing with our anxiety, I think, becomes really important. And I'll give you just sort of one example. One of the things I talk a little bit about in the book are these ideas of, having our own sort of little mantra that we can give ourselves that can get us into the right psychological state of mind, is what I call it. And, early on in my career, I was started to ask to give talks in front of bigger audiences and executive audiences. And I got so nervous. I felt like I couldn't even breathe. My hands would physically hurt. I felt like I couldn't even use them. And this went on for a couple years. I even, went to see a psychologist to talk about how to handle this. And one of their piece of advice was, to also do fewer talks, right? Was because,
Right.
make a behavioral change rather than just that. But there's this moment in my favorite TV show at the time called Sports Night.
Aaron Sorkin. Oh, that was a
Yes,
great
it
show.
was it was before The West Wing. It was just, incredible. And some of the people on there then appeared on The West Wing later on. But there's one time where one of the sportscasters, the main character, Casey McCall was the character's name, he had to go to his son's classroom and do something. And he was really nervous. And he was going to try to pretend like he baked bread, but he didn't know how to bake bread. It was this totally ludicrous things. And he comes back in and they're like, how were you? And, he said, I was triumphant. And they're like, how? And he's like, I was sitting there getting distracted by the kids playing on the playground when I was trying to think of what I was going to do. And then suddenly I had this surge of, I know what I'm doing.
Mhm.
And then his co-caster says, you called the highlights. I called the highlights. So he did the whole highlights from the recess. He did injury reports, he talked to the kids, because that's what he is, a sportscaster, right?
Right.
That's what's his forte. And so somehow that phrase, I know what I'm doing, I started using that. I've given talks before, they've gone fine. I know what I'm doing. And it was really transformative for me. If anyone's watched Ted Lasso, he says the phrase barbecue sauce, right? Before Kevin Costner's character in Tin Cup would say dollar bills before swinging, the golf club, and whatever it is, that thing that steadies you, free throw shooters all have their same little ritual of doing it the exact same way. And so, part of that is how do we manage that anxiety effectively?
Leadership is a probably $1 billion industry in our world. And it seems obvious, but given your lens as a social psychologist, as someone who studies power and in-group and out-group and everything that you study, why are leaders so impactful in our lives?
I coined a phrase a few years ago in the New York Times, and it's a central part of the book, Inspire, which is the leader amplification effect.
Hmm.
And the leader amplification effect basically says that when you're a leader, right, everything you do, even offhand small gestures, right, good things, bad things, they all get amplified and have a deep impact on other people. And, it's just one example. Our emotions generally are contagious, and we're anxious. We can make other people anxious. But when you're a leader, our emotions become truly infectious, right, and
Mhm.
really infect other people. And so one of the questions is, well, what's the essence of the leader amplification effect? And there are a couple things that I think are really important, but the foundational element, the thing that drives everything, is the word attention. And so
Hmm.
what research in psychology shows is that anything that we give to our attention increases in importance and has a greater impact on us. And so when we're in positions of leadership, right, people are looking to us because we have status. But there's also another reason why people look to us is because when we're leaders, we often have power and people are dependent upon us. And so they're looking because they want to get the rewards and avoid the punishments of someone with power. And so they're more likely to pay deep attention. Now, there's a third thing. I've studied this thing called shared attention. What happens when more than one person are looking at the same phenomenon? And research shows that when I know someone that's in my in-group, for example, is looking at the same phenomenon, it intensifies my reactions to it. So when we're in leader, we're on a stage, people are looking at us, we often have power, and we're often in an audience looking at that, person on stage. And so that's one of the reasons why they have such incredible impact. But it's not just about being a leader. And I think this is the most important thing, is that anytime someone pays attention to you, anytime someone looks up to you, right? Even if you're not in a position of leadership, then your behavior is going to have more impact, right? Think about, being in a relationship with someone, right? The gesture they make is going to have an impact because they're important to you and you're paying attention to their behavior. And so one of the most important things we have to recognize is that when we're in a position of leadership, and again, leadership is a broadly loose term for looking up to us, having authority, could be having power, is that people are going to be paying very close attention to us. And even like incidental things that we do are going to have a big impact. My favorite example of this is Barry Salzberg became CEO of Global Deloitte, right? Tens of thousands of employees across the world. And after about 6 months of being CEO, he was like, why are there bananas at every meeting? He's like, I've been at Deloitte for 30 years. Are bananas something that's like an important symbol that I somehow missed? Is there someone really important that loves bananas? So he went to his assistant. He said, hey, why do we have bananas at every meeting? And she said, because you love bananas. He's like, what? Apparently, at the very first meeting he attended, the assistant was paying very close attention to his behavior. He picked up a banana and, from her perspective, with enthusiasm and delight, ate it. And so she coded, we must have bananas at every meeting Barry's at. And so that's like a good example of this, like this incidental, he didn't even say a word, right? He didn't even say, oh, bananas, right? He just perked up a little bit, and so that shows you how close people are paying attention to your behavior. That's also important when we're feeling anxious and we're in a position of leadership. We have to remember two things. The first thing we have to remember is that our anxiety can impact other people. We also, when we're anxious, we get egocentric and we become less aware of how our behavior is impacting other people.
So where do you stand on the whole, people like me are always saying, if you have anxiety and you're a leader, it's okay. Own it.
Well, I think two things. One is, it is also true, and there's a lot of research that demonstrates this, that labeling something is, name it to tame it, and that's a catchy rhyme, but it's also true. And that research shows that when we can identify what we're experiencing, we tend to de-intensify it a little bit, right? So that's one thing. So I think there is something of recognizing that. And then I think it's okay to own it, but also I do think it's important to think about how you can harness it effectively and make sure that your anxiety is not negatively impacting other people.
Right.
And so, there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I'm a father of two young boys, like a 7-year-old and 8-year-old. And I think that one of the things that I've discovered is that when we put ourselves in that, inspiring exemplar role, like say being courageous, right? Being protector, we actually, in some ways, are able to handle the world effectively. So it's just one example. When there's someone scary on the subway, right? I immediately go, let's say, into protector mode. And I get my body in between whatever hubbub is going on over there and my kids. I let them know that I've got them safe. But because I'm in that protector role and I'm focused on them and not myself, I actually feel much less anxious. Even though in some ways the situation is more scary because, I want to protect them and there's more people that can be hurt than just me. I think that's one of the things, and this goes back to perspective taking, which is we often think we have to solve ourselves before we can help others. But But I think the reverse is often true. When we help others, we actually start to solve ourselves. And so I think sometimes, it's that classic idea that like, do I have to love myself before I love someone else? Or can I love someone else in order to find a way to love myself? And I think that what I found in my research, but also in my own personal life, is that there is a massive benefit for focusing on other people. This is a study I worked on for years, a project I worked on for years. It just got accepted. It's coming out in January 2025 in the journal Personality and Social Psychology. It's one of my favorite projects that I've worked on. The title of the paper is called The Vicious Cycle of Insecurity.
Oh.
And so basically what we do is we sort of said, well, when do people feel insecure, let's say at work,
Mhm,
right? When do
mhm.
they feel insecure, especially about their status or their standing at work? And, we did these qualitative interviews and we got things from, 200 MBA students from all over the world. And, there's a bunch of predictable patterns. Like we feel insecure when we've had past failures. We feel insecure when we're in new environments or have new responsibility. We feel insecure when we think other people are set up for better success than we are. They have more resources than we do, right? There's so many different ways that we feel insecure, but they all create the same sort of underlying psychological phenomenon. Now, one of the things that we found is that when people are feeling insecure, what they want to do is they want to increase their standing, right? They like, I'm feeling insecure about my status.
Right,
I want to
right.
bolster that in some way. And the way that they bolster it that we found consistently is they focus on themselves and advertising their own accomplishments. We did this in a variety of different ways.
Hmm.
And the Survivor TV show, for example, is one of them. But we sort of showed, for example, that we created this really cool venture capital scenario where someone is in this venture capital situation. They're going in this one sector. They get a little bit of help on their presentation from another competitor in a different sector, and they win, right? They win their thing. Now, earlier we manipulated insecurity in all the different ways I just described. Like you said, you didn't do well last time you're in this competition, or other people have more resources than you do, right? We created those situations, this is new to you. You haven't done this before.
Right.
And then we said, you get to make a speech, an acceptance speech, a victory speech. You can say whatever you want. And what we coded for was, did they only highlight what they had accomplished? Or did they thank this person, let's say we'll call them Blaine, right? In their victory speech. And what we found is that whenever we created insecurity, people were more likely to focus only on themselves. And they were less likely to acknowledge this other person. Now, here's one of my favorite studies we did is we asked people to recall a time when they felt insecure at work or they felt secure in their standing at work. And then we said, hey, you just got a promotion and we want you to write a social media post about it.
Hmm.
You can write whatever you want, like imagine it's Twitter, LinkedIn, whatever you want. And so some people wrote, I did it, all my years of hard work, I finally got the promotion, go me. And then other people were like, I just got this promotion and I'm feeling so grateful to my mentors and my teammates who really cheered me on. And we again found that when they were called time when they felt insecure, they were more likely to focus on themselves and less likely to acknowledge other people. Now, the reason why we call this the vicious cycle of insecurity is that was the first half of the paper. The second half of the paper is, let's say we had all those essays that people wrote in the venture capital, all the victory speeches in the venture capital one. We showed them to thousands of people like on the internet, and we just asked them, read the speech and rate how much status you would give this person, right? And we found that when they read the speech, they were more likely to give status to the people that actually acknowledged others, that thanked others, that expressed that gratitude. And we showed this repeatedly in different studies, even in Survivor, right? When people in the final speeches, when it's just 2 or 3 competitors, we asked people to rate, the status of the people just having read the speeches. And again, they rated the people as having higher status when they thanked other people. And in our final study, we had 2 competitors for venture capital, and you got to pick one winner. And one person said, I want to thank, a person who helped me. And in one of the studies, the person they thanked was their direct competitor. And they were always more likely to win, even when they thank their direct competitor for the help, because there's something about being generous. Now, here's the problem. When we're insecure, right? We're anxious about our standing. It makes us more egocentric and focused on ourselves. We're less likely to what we call share status, be generous with others, but that only lowers our status. And so it's again an example of perspective taking, of acknowledging other people. We're social beings. So the key to rising up is being generous, but our anxiety can sometimes prevent us from doing that.
What happens when businesses have Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA? Years of patient data gets distilled in seconds. Investors know the exact moment stocks should be traded. And quality checks speed up so production lines never slow down. No matter what business you're in, there is an AI solution that's easy to implement, secure, and tailored to you that can keep your business moving forward. Dell AI Factory with NVIDIA, your way to AI. Visit Dell.com to learn more.
Hi, this is Alex Kantrowitz. I'm the host of Big Technology Podcast, a longtime reporter and an on-air contributor to CNBC. And if you're like me, you're trying to figure out how artificial intelligence is changing the business world and our lives. So each week on Big Technology, I bring on key actors from companies building AI tech and outsiders trying to influence it, asking where this is all going. They come from places like NVIDIA, Microsoft, Amazon, and plenty more. So if you want to be smart with your wallet, your career choices, in meetings with your colleagues, and at dinner parties, tune into Big Technology Podcast on your app of choice.
One of the things that I constantly tell myself to do is sort of fake it till you make it. Like,
Yep.
I feel like Chicken Little and the sky is falling and I'm never going to get another job and everything is scarce and everyone's coming for me. But I force myself to act generous. My little mantra is, there's enough. So I guess my question is, what's your advice to actually enact that? Because a lot of us, we feel very anxious and insecure, but we can, again, change our behavior, right? We can act generous.
You just said something really important. And this is actually the key variable in our research on the vicious cycle of insecurity, the animating variable that drives that whole process is this belief that status is zero sum. We believe when we're insecure that if I acknowledge someone else, they're going to take status away from me. But in our studies, we show if you thank Blaine rises in status, but so do you. So I actually coined another phrase, which I really love, called expanding the status pie, right? The status pie isn't fixed. It can grow, and it can grow through generosity. And, that's the other thing. One of the ways we're anxious is worried about the future. So here's another thing we showed in our research. If I thank you, you're more likely to do a favor to me in the future. Let's say I'm a consultant, I do a great pitch, and the client acknowledges and says, that was a great pitch. And I say, I worked really hard on it. Or I say, thanks so much. I want to thank, Morra for helping me on this pitch, right? You're going to be more likely then to want to do me another favor in the future. Not only that, you're actually going to be more likely to give someone else a favor in the future, right? It's a true pay it forward. So when we acknowledge other people, people work so hard in the world, right? And when they have their accomplishments, they want to have them acknowledged. They want to be elevated. People want to be elevated. And so if you go around elevating people, people are going to elevate you. My late colleague, Kathy Phillips, used to have this phrase that she'd say, pour love into other people. And she gave this speech when she won this big mentoring award at the Academy of Management, like this huge thousands of persons organization. And she said, the reason why I pour love into other people is because I want love myself. And I know the more love I pour into others, the more love I'm going to get back. And so when we get anxious, we lose sight of that truth, right? We think more status for others is less status for me. But when we raise and elevate other people up, they're going to be more likely to raise and elevate us up too.
There's always more pie.
There's always more pie.
That's really interesting, right? And you're also tying into social capital as well, right? That when we act with reciprocity in mind and doing well by other people, we build our own social capital.
Absolutely.
I want to talk a little bit about your research and what you found. I mean, I think you may have started alluding to it in the beginning, the traits of great leaders that listeners need to know.
Yeah. So about 20 years ago in 2006, I was teaching the FBI, and for a variety of reasons, I ended up asking this very simple question to people. I said, tell me about a leader that inspired you, right? That changed you inside. And I started to ask, thousands and even tens of thousands of people across the globe to tell me about a leader that inspired them. And what I was able to do scientifically is really sort of like parse what those characteristics and traits are and to understand what they are. And they really fall into these three categories that I've already mentioned. Inspiring leaders are visionary, and that has some sub characteristics, which is seeing the big picture, hopeful optimism as one thing, a sort of a bigger purpose. So this optimistic, meaningful, big picture vision of the future. But what inspiring leaders also do is they simplify it into its essence. They visualize it so it comes to life in people's minds, and then they repeat it frequently. And I think there's two things that are actually really important about that. One is when we're anxious, it's hard for us to simplify sometimes, right? To see the core thing, right? That really matters. But the second thing is that when we're anxious, we need to hear that vision more times for it to stick in our minds. And I have this phrase in the book, fear doesn't hear, right? And so when we're being fearful, it's hard for us. Someone could say something to us, but we don't really hear it. And we need to hear it a second and third time. I have this story, which I really love. My wife and I went with our second child for the third trimester ultrasound. And the doctor said, I'm a little concerned about the baby's weight. And my wife said, okay, so what should I start eating, now? And she's like, no, it has nothing to do with your diet. It's probably just, an error in the ultrasound. So we're going to redo the ultrasound. And if there is a problem, it's probably the baby's positioning, pressing on the umbilical cord. And so we'll have to try to adjust the baby in some way. 15 minutes later, my wife was like, okay, so what should I start eating?
She just didn't hear it.
Yeah. So let me repeat again. It's nothing to do with your diet. It's entirely probably just an error, and it might be doing positioning. And then 2 hours later, I get a call on my phone, and I was like, so I'm at the vitamin store. So what shake should I be buying? And so I like that story because it really shows, that fear doesn't hear. But again, in this case, she didn't hear, right? But also she focused on herself, right? And what she could do, right? Which is natural. Like, what can I do to make this better? And so I think, that's just an example of to be inspiring and visionary, right? We need to see the big picture, right? And that means seeing the essence and not getting distracted by static and clutter of the mind, right? Which sometimes our fear and anxiety, insecurities clutter the mind and essentially. And then we also have to not only simplify it, but also repeat it because other people might need to hear that, again and again and again, right? And as one example, I have a piece coming out in Harvard Business Review, and I have some examples in there that aren't in the book. But one of them was I was on a call with a multinational company in 2009 during the financial crisis. And he was up, for days thinking about how to handle the fact that they were, their revenues were way lower. And one option was to lay some people off. And so he calls a company-wide meeting, and I'm there for the CEO of the company's company-wide meeting. And he says, we're not going to lay anyone off. This is what we're going to do. For the next 3 months, we're all going to take a pay cut. But the people who can afford to take a bigger pay cut will take a bigger one. So first line people will take 15% cuts. Vice presidents will take 40% cuts, and I'll take no salary over the next 3 months, right? And he said, I'm also going to give you something. We're going to close all offices at 12 p.m. on Fridays. So you can go have a little bit longer weekend, take your kids to the park, run along the beach, whatever it is that you want to do. And then hopefully we'll reevaluate in August and then come out because it was the summer, business is slower anyway. And then we'll hopefully come out and go back to full pay, by September 1st. And so he said that, and he said it very clearly. But then he sat there for the next 90 minutes and answered questions. And many of the questions were asking for information that he had already said. But he knew, he said, I'm going to sit here for as long as you want to ask questions for. And so at some point he repeated the basic essence 20 times. And at that point, there's no more questions. And so it's just another example, this was a very anxiety producing situation for people. He was prepared to say it again and again and again.
And again. So what's your advice though? Because It's not realistic to think that that leader has no anxiety.
No, he said he had had many sleepless nights worrying about it. In this case, his sleepless nights actually led to this creative solution,
Right. Okay.
Because the easy solution would be just lay people off.
Exactly. What did he do right in terms of both handling his own anxiety and then, I guess, putting it in a container or whatever he did to, again, take space? Because that's really brave to listen to 100 scared people for a half an hour.
Oh, I mean, thousands, right?
Thousands
It was
of
a
scared
company-wide
people.
thing across
Right.
all locations,
So what did he do right there?
Well, here's one thing he did right, and actually ties to one of my favorite studies I recently published that came out last year.
You're very productive.
Yeah, is that he really focused on the values. And one of their core values of the company was empowering employees. And he actually said, is there a way that I can empower my employees given this cost? And, and he thought really deeply. He knew, look, if we lay a bunch of people off and business picks up, we're going to have to rehire people. That takes a lot of time and effort. There's so much cost for laying someone off, right? So he understood that too, right? The long-term cost of laying people off. One of the worst things that can happen to you in your life is losing a job, right? Which is what this guy was trying to do. Like I got fired 3 months after my first post-college job. I was humiliated. It was miserable. And research shows it's one of the 5 most stressful events of someone's life.
Yeah.
It leads to anxiety, depression, increases the risk of suicide even. So we teamed up with the Swiss government to do an intervention in one of their employment agencies. Now, in Switzerland, you can get employment when you're laid off, but you have to go register at this unemployment agency in person. And so we did this little experiment where we asked half the people came in to do a 15-minute values reflection exercise. And this is all it involved. Think about your top 5 values in the world and place them in a hierarchy where your most important value is number 1 and all the other values kind of animate from that one. Want you to think about why those values are important to you. And we want you to think about times where you've recently demonstrated those values in your daily life. Now, 2 months later, people who had done the values reflection task were twice as likely to have a job. And the effect was so large that we stopped the study and gave everybody the values intervention, even the people that had been in the control condition. This is not just me. Other people have done it. So
Wow.
Jeff Cohen of Stanford showed he took at-risk students in middle school and over a 2-year period gave them this values task, half of them, like about 8 times over a 2-year period, so like 4 times a year. Grades improved. 5 years later, they were more likely to graduate high school and also more likely to go to college. People have been trying to understand what is the super sauce, right, that is transforming people. But there's something about reflecting on our values that centers us, that helps us see the bigger picture, that helps us be more courageous and be more generous.
Well, ACT therapists would say it helps you defuse,
Yeah.
right, from the anxiety, the limiting belief, whatever is keeping you deeply stuck.
Absolutely. And so I think that once we think about our values, and often many of our values have to do with helping other people, right? And protecting. So for me, I actually have it in my wallet, my values card, my top 5 values. My number 1 value is generosity, right? And it's about not just being generous in terms of giving people resources, but, we can be generous by giving people the benefit of the doubt, right? Probably, I would say my single greatest strength is I don't get upset at that many people. Like I see the bigger picture. I know why people are doing what they're doing. My kids love this book, Wings of Fire. I don't know I can't remember who the author is, but it's about these dragons.
Yes.
And, there's a dragon who's a mind reader. And, they're all in these different factions. There's the sea wings and the sand wings and the ice wings and the, mud wings, and they all hate each other. And this one dragon can see in the minds of other people. And he's like, how could you ever forgive these people who've done such horrible things to you? And he's like, when you get inside their minds, you realize everyone is both good and bad, right? And there's lots of complicated reasons. And this person wanted to kill me. That's true, but it's because they felt it was the only way to save their brother. And so once you know what's really driving people, we can become a little bit more generous in spirit towards even what we might see as their evil intentions.
My last question is more of a personal question, so listeners can hear. What are your own practices for staying grounded, for staying generous? How do you keep the equilibrium in your busy, I'm sure, stressful life?
I think one thing is that we observe our own life and come up with ways to be in the world. And, a good example was, I may have said this already, I can't remember, but, my son this morning, he didn't want to go to school first day back after the holidays. And he cried when he woke up. He cried when he got dressed. He cried when I took him to the school. He cried into the classroom. And at no point did I get mad at him. At no point did I get upset at him. I stayed calm and I was like, I know it's so hard. I felt this way before, tried to sympathize and empathize. And I just guided him. Now, early when I was a parent, I was a worse parent. They get to the terrible twos, I'd be like, you're stubborn, I'm going to be even more stubborn, right? You're going to use force, I'm going to use greater force. And I realized the first time that I really thought, I'm going to just, I saw my now 8-year-old son, he just fell to the ground in pure terror. Whatever expression on my face was traumatic to him. And I realized, at that moment, okay, I can't do that. And then I just started practicing being calmer and really working on it. And then the more calm I was, the more great I felt about myself. It allowed me to be even more calm. And so this morning, I was in some ways feeling so much pride in myself at being calm, and that allowed me to be calmer, which made me feel even more pride. One thing is learning the things that really, really help people. There's another thing that I invented in the world, you could say, which is I've shown that when you ask people to think about a time when they felt powerful and in control and their best self, it's truly transformative. This is something I came up with in 2003. It's been used in literally hundreds of studies across the globe, probably by hundreds of different research labs. And the research shows that when we take time, like the values reflection, but we think about when we gave a good speech and we felt in control up there on stage, or when we handled our emotions as a parent, right? And we reflect on the experience when we did that well, it kind of makes us feel super again. And then we're allowed to be a little bit more super. And so researchers in Europe have shown that when you do this, what we call the power prime, the power recall, that people are physiologically calmer. I've shown that they give better speeches. They do better job applications. I've shown it makes people more creative. It makes people feel more authentic, right? It has all of these positive effects. So I think, reflection becomes one of the primary forces, reflecting on our values, reflecting on our best selves, but also reflecting on when we were infuriating and thinking about ways that we can be less infuriating the next time. So to me, I would say the two biggest things that I do is lots of different breathing exercises, that I find. So I did transcendental meditation. So that I really like. Huberman talks about the sigh where you breathe in and then you breathe in again and then you let it out.
Yep.
And I find that really calming for me personally, but also through the reflection tasks that we have at our disposal.
That's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
That's it for this episode of The Anxious Achiever. The show is produced and edited by Mary Dew with production support and sound engineering by Nick Krinko. If you like what you heard, head to your favorite podcast app. Leave us a review. It really matters, and we appreciate the time and effort it takes. And if you don't subscribe or follow the show already, now's the time. And let us know what you'd like to hear more of. I get some of my best ideas from my listeners, so find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. You can find my weekly newsletter there as well. A big thanks to LinkedIn and all the listeners out there and our guests in the Anxious Achiever world. Until next time.